Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Madison McFerrin says she's shedding the narrative about what it means to be an artist in the music industry. In fact, Madison McFerrin says she's had to learn to shed a lot of things, like her identity. She calls herself an independent singer-songwriter, which is both true and also not entirely the whole story. Questlove calls her a soul-appella singer because she first found a wide audience doing solo a cappella songs, just her and a looping pedal. In fact, from pretty much the start of her professional career, she was turning tastemaker heads. She was called out by the likes of KCRW and Pitchfork. And that's due in large part, I think, to the quiet determination and courage of her music. Just getting out on stage alone with a looping pedal in her voice and creating lush arrangements from scratch every time. And while some of her songs deal with the personal, the sensual, the searching soul, others are more overtly political or topical, like her song Can You See, that deals with police violence.
They say, stop, step back, hands up, look down. That won't keep you out the ground. Wounded for what we've earned.
Madison McFerrin is also the daughter of Bobby McFerrin, probably the most famous and influential improvising singer alive today. She says that what she does really isn't very related to what her father does, despite being related to her father. And she wears that legacy loosely and comfortably, drawing on his encouragement and advice, but cautious not to seek too many comparisons. One way that she does refer to him as a model for her career is in the way he avoids being placed in any one genre or style or box. She says, "My father calls himself a folk musician because he sings the music of the folk, and I consider myself to be a soul musician because I sing the music of the soul." Nonetheless, Madison McFerrin, like her father before her, finds herself skating, if not scatting, on the surface of jazz. On the one hand, as she says, jazz is at the root of all popular music. So if she is part of the contemporary jazz space, it's because she's part of the contemporary world today. But on the other hand, she's contributing to the conversation whether she meant to or not. This week, she'll perform at the Brick Jazz Fest in Brooklyn. And in addition to playing, she also guest curated the lineup of the festival. And she has a lot of thoughts about how to bring an audience that reflects her, both in terms of generation, identity, and taste, back to jazz. Or maybe how to lead jazz back to people who reflect her generation, identity, and taste. In a relatively short span of time, Madison has had a few standout moments, and in some ways, it's not simply a question of what happened, but also how she handled it. For example, in 2016, she was invited to sing the national anthem at a Hillary Clinton rally, and it ended up being a little ill-fated. As she tells it, she bombed. But I've seen the footage, and ultimately, it was totally fine. In any case, she got some negative feedback, quite a bit of negative feedback, actually, on Twitter and the online echo chamber. I mean, imagine, you're a young singer just starting out with the burden of being Bobby McFerrin's daughter, and then that. Not easy. So what did she do? She channeled all that energy back into her work, into her career, and she put out a single called Try that addressed it head-on. And that song went on to be one of her most successful and most appreciated songs. She tells me, we wouldn't be talking today if it weren't for that event. And in our conversation, she explains exactly what she means. And earlier this year, on the day that Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd, Madison went home and improvised a simple, funky, loopy track called Guilty that got passed around and catapulted her into yet another dimension of modern success. She went viral.
That motherfucker's guilty. 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 That motherfucker's guilty.
She tells me, I originally thought I was just going to be an artist who showed up. But if you don't adjust now, you're going to fall behind. The music industry is changing more rapidly than pretty much any other industry. We talked last week about all this and much more. She was just back in New York after a trip in California and headed to Prague the next day for a one-off gig. Third-story.com is the place for you to go. Sign up, subscribe, get involved, check out the archive. I'm reminded of previous conversations with other jazz not jazz singers like Satchel Vasandani, Becca Stevens, talked to her twice, Michael Mayo, Camila Meza, Kat Edmondson, Jacob Collier, as well as some other folks who will join her at Brickfest this year, including Kurt Elling, Charlie Hunter, and Louis Cato. As I often do, I have curated a Spotify playlist and some YouTube clips related to our talk today, and you can find all that and more at third-story.com. And then it's patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast to make your own quiet contribution to the conversation. Here's me and Madison McFerrin talking it down. Thank you for making time today, because I know you are like in it right now. You're
no problem.
Right in between.
Yeah, I just got back in town late Friday and leaving tomorrow evening. So,
is that like a throwback feeling? Does it sort of feel like the before times?
Yeah, does a little bit, which is a good thing. So,
yeah, but I also saw that you had to reschedule some dates recently, right? You were supposed to go to Europe.
Yeah, it was the second time I was rescheduling as well. So that was, and where I'm going to Prague tomorrow, and that's the one date that they didn't want to push back again. So I was like, all right, well, I'll go fly to Prague for a day.
Yeah, it's so disruptive. It's so hard to make plans right now, right? It's so hard to plan anything.
Yeah, totally.
What are you doing while not making plans?
Making other kinds of plans. So plans that I can control.
Such as?
Music stuff, like making music, figuring out those kinds of plans, how to work all that stuff out.
It seems to me that one of the things that you took advantage of with the space that COVID afforded you was diving deeper into exploring how to produce on your own, how to like expand the palette.
Yeah, production was probably the biggest or new thing that the COVID experience has brought me.
Staring at the computer for years going, I gotta deal with this. I gotta figure
out. Totally.
But man, I've seen some footage of you dealing with the looping and the Ableton push and all this stuff. And like you were already, I mean, even though you were essentially doing a cappella stuff, you were like already deeply technical before you started doing production stuff.
Well, really just in the standpoint of like being able to navigate the loop pedal that I had. But other than that, it's funny now that I'm going to Europe, this is the first time going to Europe, not just doing the loop pedal stuff. And so I had to have this moment a couple days ago where I was like, oh man, I need to like get a different kind of adapter. And like, I need to figure out how I'm going to plug all this stuff in, because even though it's really just 3 things that I'm plugging in, 3 is more than 1. So, and that requires more power. So I had a couple days ago, I was like doing all this research about what kind of converter I should get and all that kind of stuff. So that's a bit of a different dynamic, but it works. So.
And when you perform, is it solo performance?
Yeah.
Have you had it go like totally wrong ever?
Yeah, there. Probably the worst gig I've had was in Amsterdam, and it was with my loop pedal stuff. And when I do my loop pedal stuff, I was navigating everything with my toes. It was like my feet and my toes, and so I really only glanced down for like a second every once in a while. And it was the first time I was performing with this like head chain that my friend gave me, and it was really distracting. And I ended up pressing a button. I pressed like the wrong button and a different loop triggered. And it was a whole thing where I was like, oh my God, this has never happened. And now I have to do this all over again. There have been times when I would restart a loop from the beginning, but that was usually like me being very particular about timing in a way that like probably most people didn't even recognize, but I was like, this is going to throw me off. So I'm just going to start this again, which I never really had any issues saying that when I needed to. But the show in Amsterdam was definitely the one where I was like, wow, that did not go well.
You sort of have made a point when the comparison to your dad comes up where you say, well, I'm not an improvising scat singer. Mm-hmm. But There is something extremely risky about doing solo looped vocal performance.
100%. It's very risky. One of the things that I really got from my dad is, his ability to, he is very free on stage. And there's really this element of like no fear. And even in moments, I saw him do things on stage where like he would, if he didn't like it, he would just start something completely different and like not having any shame in that. And just really being open on stage about moments that he was into or not into. Mm-hmm. And I think that definitely has been something that I've been trying to emulate. I think I have made certain mistakes on stage that other people would get really freaked out about, whereas I'm just kind of like, okay, that was a mistake. I'm the only person up here. I don't have anybody else to blame for that but myself. And I think that's probably, I do that best on stage versus off stage. I think off stage that you can have other things to point to, but being on stage solo, like I can only hold myself accountable. And I think that there's an element of my personality that needs that. It's incredibly risky, but I think that's part of the fun.
Yeah, I think, the difference between being totally free on stage and letting something happen and follow it or decide that you don't like where it's headed and so you want to pivot. And what you do is that you are trying to execute a specific thing, mm-hmm. but you're trying to execute it fresh every time. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that the sort of the unknown factors are limitless, but they're always relative to you trying to make this thing happen in the moment.
One of the things with that is like I've had experiences where I've been like, I nailed that. And so if I have that reference point, why am I not trying to hit that reference point every time, or even if there are certain things that I think are a little challenging, whenever I accomplish it, I'm like, okay, that I can do that. That's cool.
You got into doing this a cappella thing, you say, as a kind of a happy accident. Like this wasn't necessarily some magical vision that you had. It was something that you sort of stumbled into.
Yeah, it was like totally not the intention. I was working on an album with my brother, and I went to LA to record the vocals, and he was just going to produce one song, but I really liked it. And so I was like, I want you to produce the whole thing. But he was working on his own album. And so I had to wait. I was doing these solo shows and I was doing them all by myself and I was looping, but I also had a synthesizer and I had a couple songs that were just all a cappella. I was getting more gigs in New York, but I was also getting a lot of gigs that were only like 20 minutes. And it didn't, with the looping stuff, songs are longer because you have to do every single layer. So like a song like Insane, I think is like 7.5 minutes or something when I do it live.
Because you have to build it from the ground up. You have to build every piece
exactly.
of it.
And like, there's no like fast forward or nothing's preloaded. So it was like, I had to do, and that one also has the most layers to it.
I would love to scream your name, and I would gladly fall in vain for this, grasping memories between my.
But like each thing takes time, takes a lot of time. And so when I would get these shorter gigs, I would ditch my synthesizer because it didn't make sense to me to bring a synthesizer for one song. I could usually only play like 3 songs. And I was like, it doesn't make sense for me to bring a synthesizer for just one song. So I'll just do these couple a cappella songs that I have. And people seemed really into it. The stuff with my brother was taking longer. So I was like, you know what? I have these few a cappella songs. I'll just record them and release them as kind of a way to build some buzz before I release this other thing that I really want to express. And then that took off way more than I was anticipating, and all kind of in a way where I was a little put off, because I was like, oh, whoa, this isn't actually what I'm trying to do or like be known for. I'm just good at it. But like, you know, people wanted what they wanted, and so I kind of just went with it.
So what do you do when the thing that isn't really your intention, it's not the message you're necessarily intending to send, is the thing that really connects? And now you've got this relationship with an audience and a public that sort of wants something from you, and you're getting ready to like move on. You know, did you feel any tension between what was working and what was successful for you and what you thought you should be doing?
Totally. Yeah, no, I felt a lot of tension just because I wasn't trying to even promote that stuff as much. And so it would be this thing where it was like, okay, well, I have to promote this music, but like, this isn't what I want to be known for, especially because I wasn't trying to be like, oh, Bobby McFerrin's daughter also does a cappella. You know, I did it because it was fun and it sounded good and it was easy for me. And it took me a little bit before I recognized that I was actually like a very skilled looper. Like there are obviously a lot of loopers who are very skilled, but I think that the majority of people that you see implement it in a show, it takes a lot of skill, like to have the timing, to have the intonation, to like do everything, to make everything line up really well. I think that I took that for granted, the fact that I could do it well. And so I was just kind of like, I didn't really understand why people were as impressed as they were, which I think it just has to do with my own, you know, self-criticism and whatnot. But it really has only been, I gotta say, in the last like year and a half, 2 years that I've really embraced it. Not even 2 years, I would say a year and a half is probably better. Really embraced it as something that I enjoy and that I'm good at it. And so I'm like, I don't want to keep having this relationship with my own art as if it's not something that I enjoy, because I do really enjoy it. And, you know, this is just the path that I had to take to gain my own confidence in my own musicality. And I'm really grateful for that, because I think the fact that I did something that is very difficult out the gate, I think that probably built my confidence up more than if I was in a band. I mean, I was in a band in college, and that was like the very first layer of building my foundation of self-confidence in my voice. But then I think, you know, how can you tell me I can't sing if I'm doing all a cappella stuff by myself? You know, so I think like having that was just like the necessary layer for me to be like, no, this is I'm good at this, and this is what I want to do, and like, here's how I'm going to prove this to you.
I think choosing to be a singer under any circumstances is an act of courage and bravery, and takes a certain kind of person who's willing to walk up on stage and use just this thing that is part of their body as the mode of communication. And you come with this added baggage because, as you say, you know, you're Bobby McFerrin's daughter. And yet it doesn't seem like you were totally preoccupied with that. I guess I'm curious about when you knew you wanted to be a singer, or like what your early relationship with singing was.
I decided I wanted to be a singer when I was 5. I didn't even really allow myself the option to think about other stuff. Looking back, I'm like, that's kind of crazy. That's not how that usually works out. But I mean, I think that just goes to show you that like when you have a reference point of somebody being able to do what they love as their career, you know, why not go after that yourself? And I have 2 older brothers who are 10 and a half and 6.5 years older than me. So even at that point, they were old enough for me to see the passions that they had. And, you know, I'm very blessed to have parents who were all about cultivating the things that we were really interested in. I just kind of like decided I wanted to be a singer. I really enjoyed doing it. And then I didn't really allow myself to think of any other paths.
All comparisons aside, one thing that seems really different about your approach is that even though you belong to this legacy, you also seem to be totally DIY. Like you're pretty new school about the way you make music and release it. You're independent. That's probably not something that was easily modeled for you, right? Like, I mean, your dad certainly belonged to the old school.
For sure. I mean, if anything, it's been something that's been one of the more difficult transitions mentally for me, is because I definitely grew up with an example of the old school mentality of how the music industry works. And even in college, I was in college from 2010 to 2014, and the music industry of 2010 to 2014 is completely different to the music industry of now, a decade later. So, I had to do a lot of shedding the narrative that I had of like what it means to be an artist in the music industry. And like I said, I decided I wanted to sing when I was 5. So with that even came along of like shedding my own identity of what that meant, because so much of it was wrapped up in who I am as a person that I hadn't really questioned the system in the same kind of way, especially given that I saw it work so well for my dad. But there were even things in that like I didn't have enough knowledge of to recognize that, he's never had like a major record contract. I think all of his projects have been album by album, which for that time is a little different as well. Like that's a bit more common now, but I have had to unlearn and relearn a lot of stuff that I definitely wasn't anticipating needing to do. I was just literally having this conversation where, I really thought that I was just the artist that showed up, but then now we're in this new world where it's like, no, you also have to do all of these other things, especially because nobody's really doing A&R anymore in the same kind of way. And on top of that, there's so much more access that you can have as an independent artist. Like back when my dad was doing stuff, it wasn't the case that like you couldn't get on the radio if you didn't have a record label. That couldn't happen. Like they were the gatekeepers. They had all of the resources. They knew all of the people, versus now with the internet and social media, it's like you don't need to have those people in order to get to certain places. I mean, granted, to get on top 40 radio, if as an independent artist, is not impossible, as you see with Lil Nas X. Like that's like a whole different bag. But like by the time that he did get to number 1, he had Sony behind him, helping him out with that. So there are definitely ways that the major labels still are gatekeepers, but they're mostly gatekeepers to like a certain realm of music. Like they are the gatekeepers to top 40 radio, and they've always been, and they still have a stronghold on that. But there are different ways to be able to even get access into those spaces now. So it's kind of like, if you don't adjust now, you're going to fall behind, because the music industry, I feel like, is probably changing more rapidly than, I would say, like 90% of industries that are happening right now. It's constantly changing. The music industry of today is different from 3 years ago.
Yeah.
It's different than last year, so if you're not trying to evolve with what's happening, then it probably won't work out for you.
I think about that thing that you just said a lot in terms of what an artist is, or our expectations of what an artist is. You said you thought you were the artist who just showed up and everything else would happen. And it's like, I do think that there are still people out there who are exceptionally gifted in just doing the one thing, but they don't know how to navigate the rest of it. And then there are others who are more adept at like managing social media, producing their own material, making their own videos. I look at some of your videos, and you edited some of your videos also, like you've sort of like had to figure out how do I execute this and be as self-contained as I can in order to thrive. It's just an open question. I don't expect you to have the definitive answer, but it's like an open question of how are we benefiting from that? And what are the disadvantages to having to be so responsible for all of those aspects?
It's a good question. One of the ways that I think it's very beneficial is just being able to have knowledge outside of the immediate artist knowledge. It's very beneficial for me to have a better understanding of, how engagement works on social media or how to just do various things, because at the end of the day, that means that if and when it gets to the point where I have other people doing these things, just from a I don't have time standpoint, not even like I don't want to be actively doing these things. Some things I don't want to be doing anymore. So it's like I got to get to a place where that I can have somebody else that's doing that. But one of the things that comes along with having the knowledge of how to do a lot of this stuff is that I can then hold somebody else accountable. Mm-hmm. It's not the case that somebody can take advantage of me in the same kind of way where they can say like, oh, we can't do that. But I could say, actually, I know you can because I've done it myself. Or, even having better understanding of how me communicating directly with fans has a better turnaround rate for certain things than if I wasn't engaging with them directly. Just having that kind of knowledge, having a better understanding of what contracts look like. There's so many things where it's like, even if I just have base level knowledge, somebody can't come along and be like, oh, I did all of these things and I have no way of, checking their work. So I think that that's important. I know that from my own experience, needing to juggle all of those things isn't always beneficial to my art. And so that's difficult. That is a difficult thing to try and navigate, where it's like, I don't want to send out 100 emails because that is going to take X amount of hours and I could be using those X amount of hours to create art. Like that's probably been the hardest thing to balance. Like one time I responded to every single comment on a YouTube video, on the colors video, and it took me 4 hours. And it's like, was that the best use of my 4 hours? Maybe not, but maybe out of the 300 people that I replied to, 5 of them end up buying a vinyl or something. It's just like, you got to try and figure out what the balance is. I think overall, it's probably better for artists to have at least the base knowledge of a lot of stuff that's going on around them, just because I've seen firsthand other people, and even myself, like very early on, like get taken advantage of because I don't know how to hold certain people accountable / I don't have the belief that I can just do it myself. There are a lot of things that are actually a lot easier than I think we're told they are, especially as an artist, especially as a woman, as a Black woman. I've been fed this narrative that like specifically white men are supposed to do certain things. And not just they're supposed to do certain things, but like, you kind of get fed this message. It's usually a little more undercover, but it's like, I can't learn those things. So just like getting away from that narrative, I think is helpful as well.
I love that answer. And you mentioned the colors video, and it reminds me of the other piece of the way artists are expected to engage with their audience, with their public, whatever, or that they can choose to reveal more or less of themselves, maybe now than it was easy to do back in the day when there were all those gatekeepers. And the colors video that you did is for the song Try, which I think in a way is a great example of how you absorbed a personal / professional experience and sort of recycled it publicly into more art. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that whole experience?
Which element of the experience?
I mean, I would start with, you started out earlier in the interview telling me that your nightmare gig happened on stage in Amsterdam when the looper, you were distracted by a necklace. But you also have another pretty notorious public gig that fed this whole project.
It's funny, I just like don't even think about that as a gig. So it's like, sure, I guess that was the worst one. But if anything, it's not the worst one because I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you had that not happened. So everything happens for a reason, and I'm totally fine with that. Yeah, I bombed the national anthem, and a lot of people, they don't realize that the audience was singing along with me. And so but you can't hear them because I'm the only one that's mic'd. And so I wasn't about to tell them to stop singing the national anthem, even though I had been like strenuously rehearsing a completely different version. But it was like, all right, we're just going with this. And so, yeah, that whole thing happened. I bombed. People made fun of me. It really sucked. But it made me grow a much thicker skin. It's one of those things where it was like, I kept thinking about if I wrote a memoir, this is the part in the memoir where either that happens and then like my dreams are ruined, or I'm like, this is the moment that I had that, it was a bump in the road and like I moved on. And I figured the latter was probably a much better route to go, especially since I told you I decided I wanted to do this from the time I was 5. Wasn't about to let one bad gig get in the way of me accomplishing my dream. And funny enough, Try isn't even about that. The song Shine on Finding Foundations Volume 2 is actually about that.
And I find that if you run to the past, then how can you enjoy the ride? Oh, but you can't afford anything you want, just explore your mind. Your mind. Oh, and what matters more is you know what you want, don't ignore your shine. Your shine.
But when I was trying to think of music videos for Try, I figured that it worked well narratively speaking. And since this was like the first single that was going to be not a cappella, I was like, let me catch up folks real quick. And in the music video, the intro with Snoop making fun of me, I had heard of that happening, but I hadn't watched it when it happened because I was absolutely devastated. And when I was trying to figure out the music video in my mind, I was like, maybe in the intro, I'll play that Snoop video. And the first time I watched it was when I was trying to see if the timing worked out, and it fits perfectly in the intro. So as soon as I figured that out, I was like, okay, well, this is what it has to be, especially because it gives you kind of like a person, place, and thing. It sets the stage of like, okay, something so bad that this person that people know made fun of it on the internet. Because actually in the original, the first cut, there was like in the intro, there was like text kind of explaining what happened. And I was like, I don't want this. I don't want the text. I just want to like give you this image and this video.
Did you hear that terrible rendition of Oh Say Can We See for Hillary Clinton? If you didn't, the video is coming right up. Oh wow, this is horrible.
I know it's a fight to try and listen, 'cause I might not know what to say.
And all of those comments that are in the video, those are real things that people said to me. There's so much bullying that happens on social media and on the internet that I think I just wanted to let people know that it's okay and that you can move on. Because I was 24 when that happened. And, it was hard on me. And so that made me think about all these teenagers that go through this. And I'm like, I don't know what I would have done had I been 16 or 15 when, people around the globe are making fun of me on the internet and people who don't know me. So I just wanted to be really honest about all the stuff that happened and hope that it would, just make at least one person feel better about whatever they're going through. 'Cause like, at least they didn't get made fun of by Snoop Dogg on the internet, So like, if that could make one person feel better, then that's great. it made me feel better. It also like helped me release a lot of stuff. It's so funny. It's like after that whole situation happened, it took me maybe like 2 months before I could really talk about it. Yeah. So that was June, like first week of June 2016. And then I had my first solo show September 10th, 2016. And that solo show literally came out of the fact that I was like, you know what? I've been too scared to do a solo show. Y'all are telling me I can't sing. I'm gonna book this solo show. And it actually happened that at that first solo show, I ended up talking about it. And it was such a release. And like every time I talk about it, it's a different kind of release. At this point, I don't really feel much about it at all. But it's also a thing where like if somebody tries to make fun of me about it, it's like I've talked about it a million times. You can't make fun of me about it. Like I'm aware of it.
You've owned it. I mean, that it becomes this incredible shield because you've reclaimed it, you know?
Right, exactly.
And it is very powerful. It's a very powerful statement, but I also think that it's a kind of statement that really, truly, and only can be done in this independent and very personal way. I mean, I'm sure if you had a team and you had, you know, 1 million people, you could still sort of conceptually do the same thing. But there's something so powerful about knowing that the same person who might take a morning to respond personally to a bunch of YouTube comments is the person who is ideating this thing and creating this thing. It's like it's really it felt to me like it was coming from you, and you were like sucking all of it up and becoming more empowered by the whole experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's another song also that is newer, and that's Guilty, which lyrically is very simple. But again, something that really connected automatically, very quickly with people, something pretty intuitive, I think, that came from you. It was a reaction to the verdict of guilty that Derek Chauvin received for the murder of George Floyd, and it was so raw. I don't know what you feel that it has represented in your career or how it worked for you, but I remember when you posted it, I remember that it went viral. I remember the video that you ended up making of it with the dancing. I remember the sense of immediacy that I felt from it when I watched it. I just thought it was so awesome.
Yeah, the guilty thing was totally, it was funny because so that whole day, you know, we all knew that it was happening that day. We knew the verdict was coming out that day. I went to a studio to re-record some piano parts for a track. And it was right in the middle of the day when I knew that this was going to be happening. So I was kind of trying to get in and out of the studio as quickly as possible. And I think I was only there for about an hour. My partner picked me up and we were in the car and there was also a meeting happening in the car over the phone. While we're on this meeting, I'm also like simultaneously checking Twitter because any minute now we're supposed to get the verdict. And so while we're in this meeting, I check my phone. It says he's guilty on all 3 counts. And I look at Ned and I'm like, he's guilty on all 3 counts. And he kind of gave me this look of like, you should not be looking at this right now. We're in a meeting. But as soon as I saw that, I totally checked out of the rest of the meeting. It wasn't like a super like important one. It was a, very friendly conversation with somebody. So I think the fact that I zoned out wasn't the worst thing, but I just had this loop in my head. And, one of the insights that I've gotten from being independent and doing stuff is like, if you're going to talk about a topic, you have to be very on top of it. And so, we're in the car and as soon as we get to our apartment, I'm like, I got to get out right now. I got to do this right now. And so I get out, I go and I like start to make this loop. And I think within about 10 minutes of us being home, that video got recorded. And I was like, okay, I'm going to post this. And so I was like, okay. And so then that was that. Funny enough, it didn't go viral on TikTok because it was 420 and I had posted something relatively explicit and then they had taken it down. And so then my following video, which was guilty, didn't get picked up in the same way. But then, it was all over Instagram and Twitter. And I guess I picked up on the joy that people were feeling in the moment, which I'm grateful for. And I only got a hand, I could count on one hand the amount of negative comments I got. And I think that really goes to show when you're doing something out of respect and from a place of love and joy, I think people really resonate with that. Since the national anthem thing, I have not gotten that many like haters in the same kind of way. Like I could probably count them on two hands, maybe three. And, that's now it's been 5 years, which is crazy to think about. But people just really connected with it and it resonated. And it also, people all of a sudden were like, please release this. And so then it forced me to make an actual song, which ended up being, in terms of the production, is like one of my favorite, if not like what I think is potentially the best beat I've ever produced. Mm-hmm. And so like it kind of turned into this whole other thing. And so that was really enjoyable. And, making art for other people to enjoy is always fun.
Kind of circling back to that question that I asked earlier about, what do we do about being artists? What does it mean to be an artist today where the expectation is you have to be able to do all these things? And I loved your answer where you said, well, it helps you to hold people to account. The other thing, though, that I am feeling from you is that actually, in your case anyway, your output is often informed by being plugged into the sort of great, circuit of information. Like you said this thing about how at least with catching the algorithm, that if you're going to put something current up, you need to be at the front of the wave, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like you have this intersection between inspiration and sort of like current events, or like and the algorithm where they have to happen really quickly, mm-hmm. and then they turn into an actual piece of work, not just a side project, but like I think Guilty is part of your repertoire now, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty funny. And it's like a house beat, and I in no way was intending on being a house producer. So things just happen. So you go with it. You're
playing the Brick Jazz Fest in Brooklyn shortly, basically, mm-hmm. when this comes out. Are you going to do Guilty?
You'll have to come and find out.
Not only are you playing at the Brick Jazz Festival, but you were also asked to be a co-curator of the festival. What does being attached to jazz, associated with jazz adjacent, or even a jazz artist mean to you today? I mean, you move in and out of the jazz space, let's say. What is your relationship with it, and how is it for you to take what you do into a jazz space?
Well, I don't really consider myself a jazz artist. I definitely have jazz influences, which is almost impossible not to when you're related to a jazz musician. But I think that, jazz is pretty much the roots of pop music and all popular music. So jazz has such a wide range of what is possible. When Brick asked me to co-curate, I thought that, exploring what it meant to be jazz was a really awesome question to ask myself and to ask an audience, essentially, because it's very much not a straight ahead jazz lineup at all. Granted, I think a lot of festivals that are labeled like jazz festivals, blues festivals, they're usually not straight ahead. I remember seeing a lineup for like the Ottawa Jazz Festival or Ottawa Blues Festival years ago, and it was like Snoop Dogg and Lady Gaga. So I'm not trying to say that like most festivals that have a genre attached to them necessarily adhere to it, but it was just a fun challenge to kind of think about what jazz means to me and how I can express that through the people that I asked to be on the bill. No Time to Lose, which is probably my most popular a cappella song, that and Insane, but No Time to Lose, as soon as I wrote it, I was like, this is a jazz song.
You didn't want it before, so why are you here waiting? I don't understand why you think I am contemplating on ways for you to love again. Everything that you're missing, saying a premonition's got you a change in your mind. Boy, stop your reminiscing, cause I won't play the fool again. Every day you're gone, every day I move on.
And like same with the song Know You Better on You and I. As soon as I wrote that, I was like, this is a jazz song.
Tables are turning, must be the speed. Skype me over observing under your lights. So would it be wise to read your mind? Think I might find anything I'd like to know you're deserving. Would you
From like a melody standpoint, it's very jazzy, both of those. And so even though I don't consider myself a jazz artist, I inherently end up doing a lot of things that are jazz, and so do my friends. And so I was like, how can I invite some of my friends to be a part of this and kind of just explore what jazz is?
Yeah, totally. And I don't think there's an answer. I think there's only questions,
Right.
which is great. And I think it does open a question, though, about whether the world wants you to belong to jazz. Like if you felt that sometimes you're received in a certain way because of your last name.
Mm-hmm. No, totally. I think that especially with the acapella stuff, a lot of people were trying to pigeonhole me into jazz. And I was like, no, that's not what I think this is. And that's not what I'm trying to gear this towards, especially because, unfortunately, and this is also something else I was trying to address with the lineup for Brick Jazz Fest. Unfortunately, a lot of like jazz stuff is geared towards mostly older white people. I would say older people in general, but like especially older white people. And that's not the kind of audience that I was trying to cultivate. Like not to be of offense or to even say that I don't want that audience. It was more so that when I got on stage, I was trying to see my peers in the audience. And oftentimes with straight ahead jazz stuff, that's not going to be the audience that you get. There were a lot of shows in the beginning with my acapella stuff where, venues, they wanted to put out like tables and chairs and like felt like it was more of a lounge vibe. And I was like, no, people are going to stand up and people are going to like be close to the stage. Like this isn't just because I'm doing acapella stuff does not mean that this is one jazz. And it also does not mean that people aren't going to have a good time and aren't going to want to move and dance and stuff like that. Granted, I didn't have like a lot of dancey music, but I did have my peers in the audience and I wanted that to be reflected globally. There were a few labels that reached out to me initially and they were like pretty much straight ahead jazz labels. And I was like, this isn't the audience that I want to reach out to in a coordinated fashion. I'm trying to reach a different audience. And so, there was definitely a fight in the beginning from myself and from my team to try and make sure that I was not being pigeonholed and that I was not just being put in a lane that wasn't expansive. That's not to say that like, there are some incredible jazz musicians right now that are really switching the game up. Like I love Shabaka Hutchings and, like everything that he does is really amazing. So much like UK jazz especially is really exciting at the moment, or even in the States, like Melanie Charles and Micaiah McCraven, they're doing really amazing things with jazz and obviously somebody like Robert Glasper has really taken it to a place of like, it's not, our parents' jazz in the same kind of way and not allowing ourselves to be pigeonholed into just what that old term means or like in terms of how older people think of jazz. But I mean jazz has always been evolving. It's a very evolutionary genre. So I think that I was very intentional with this festival to make sure that it showed a wide spectrum of what jazz really is.
You know, I appreciate you just saying jazz has become a music that tends to attract a white audience. And actually, I mean, you went to Berklee College of Music, and I wonder what you experienced just in terms of the intersection of education and jazz.
Yeah. Berklee was an interesting place because, you know, even though it started as a jazz institution, it really has tried to mold itself to be more of a contemporary music institution, but it has deep roots in jazz. And so, you know, there would be some teachers that like they are teaching explicitly jazz theory and don't think that any other theory matters. There are other teachers where they have like a more eclectic view of that. And that was even represented in the student body. There would be certain musicians where it was like, if it was not classic standard jazz, like it didn't matter. Essentially, it was like no other music compared, no other music was as good. You know, standard jazz was the pinnacle of music and you couldn't tell them anything else. So it was a really interesting dynamic to be in and like be around so many people. I wouldn't say that was the majority of students at all. It was definitely a smaller contingent, but that contingent was very gung-ho on like jazz is jazz and that is it. And like that is only the type of music that I want to know and learn. And I think that, you know, there are other institutions now that are still very much more jazz, but I think that Berklee, at least while I was there, was actively trying to not just be that.
So if you weren't identifying yourself specifically as a jazz artist, and maybe it doesn't matter how you were identifying, maybe the genre or the title is kind of irrelevant, but like how would you have described the kind of space that you want to occupy?
So I'm going to reference my father in this because I think he has a good answer for what he does. So everybody calls my dad a jazz singer. He calls himself a folk singer because he believes he sings the music of the folk. That's what he says.
I love that.
Similarly, I think of myself more as a soul musician because I sing music from my soul. So even though that might not be, you know, I'm not like Jill Scott or Aretha Franklin or something like that. And my music isn't even that similar in the same way. But I think that the fact that I am conveying stuff that's from the deepest parts of my soul, that's what I say. I don't think you necessarily hear my music and are like, oh yeah, no, that's a soul singer. I don't think that like from a genre standpoint, that might not be what people immediately associate it with, but that's kind of the term that I think fits most with how I feel about how I engage with music.
I mean, you know, when I listen to you and I actually do hear a tie to Jill Scott. I mean, it feels like maybe neo soul or soul would be a place to place it.
Yeah.
When did it begin? How do we end? So much time consuming, trying to pretend.
I mean, okay, so I love Jill Scott. Jill Scott is amazing. And I actually had a moment a couple months ago. I was in the car driving and I was listening to some of her music. And it was the first time that I had realized how much she influences, because I was about to say influenced, but that's past tense, how much she influences my style of writing, particularly as it pertains to how I approach melody and lyrics, mostly melody. But, you know, I was listening to, I think it really clicked with this song, The Fact Is I Need You. And I was listening to it and I used to listen to that song on repeat when I think I was in high school at the time when it came out. And as I was singing along with it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like totally how I approach the majority of my melodies.
I can pay my own light bill, baby.
So she's a major influence. So I would love to be in company with her. So I don't even try and say that as like a, there obviously are alignments with that. I think some people, just when you say soul, it probably evokes a different thought than probably the stuff that I do for some folks, but I would happily be in company with her.
I think you are in company with her.
Thank you.
I stumbled onto this video of you and Marc Rebillet doing guess Saturday afternoon hang, one of his crazy hangs. And it was a reminder to me of the way people from the internet convene sometimes and like come together, because like Marc to me is like, even though I know I can go see him play or whatever, like he's like from YouTube as far as I'm concerned. Like that's that guy from YouTube. And then you walk into the frame and it's like, oh, now she's in the YouTube clip. Now I know her from the Guilty video. And now she's here. She's in the like, and it's just funny the way viral people, and for the purpose of this example, I'm going to call you a viral person, like interact with one another. Do you feel that part of you sort of belongs to this sort of tribe of or community of people who are existing in cyberspace and interacting with one another?
I think it's a place that I'm visiting. I don't think it's a place that I inhabit.
Yeah.
I just happened to get a ticket there one day. It's funny though, because the thing with Marc totally happened because of Guilty. We had both been aware of each other. But then when Guilty happened, so many people commented on it being like, Marc Rebillet, like either trying to be like, oh, she's coming for your crown, which was not in any way what was happening at all. And that sparked him reaching out, just being like, hey, we should link up because, I've been a fan of yours and, the internet is telling us to. And so then that happened. And that led to a whole other cohort of people becoming fans of mine, because his fans are nuts in the best way, but they latch on real tight. And so props to him for really making that happen, because I also went and sat in with him. He had a summer stage show in August. And, it just goes to show you that, like, if you cultivate an internet community, that can definitely translate into real life, because he's selling out shows, his tours are getting sold out, people are there for him, and it just comes from this YouTube that he's been doing every week. And so that was really fun. I had such a good time doing that with him. We had laughed a lot. It reminded me a lot of just like having fun with my dad and experimenting and just like being wacky.
I think it's funny because it's like it is clearly improvised. Throw it out in the world, see what happens. It's a one-time thing. But because it's on the internet, it also kind of lives forever, or for as long as, you choose. So it's both. It's kind of like a total wacky jam session, but it's also part of your oeuvre of stuff that you've done. Do you feel pressure when you walk into a space like that? Like, oh, this shit's going to be here forever. Like, I got to make sure it's going to be cool. Or can you just let go?
I don't think about that at all. Do not think about it. I didn't even really know what I was getting myself into with that. I just kind of let it happen and went with the flow and had a good time and would totally do it again. But I don't even think about like things living on the internet forever. I think that if I did, I probably wouldn't put anything on the internet.
And yet, as you say, part of Marc's great gift is the consistency with which he churns out these jams, and so that he's able to build this loyal following. Mm-hmm. Do you think about your consistency? Are you aware of like how often you are showing up and interacting and posting and doing all that stuff?
I am terrible with consistency. That is not a thing that I'm good at. Marc has that down to a T. I think I psych myself into thinking that if I do something consistently, that's going to put me in a box, and I don't want to do that. Also, I'm like granted in COVID, I was home a lot more, but like in the before times, I was gone all the time. So it was like, what can I be consistent with? I have my own things to work on when it comes to that specific thing of consistency. So, I think that I'm probably doing it wrong. He's doing it right. I think people like having consistency. That doesn't always work with my brain, but I'm trying to train it to do that.
I know that this is a sacred hour of your day because you are flying tomorrow and you were just home for a tight weekend.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, is there a space that we haven't gone to? Anything you want to talk about?
I don't think so. You covered a wide array of topics. I'm working on new music. So I think that is the thing that I'm really excited about right now. Doing a lot of production on my own, which is not something that I would have thought. And I'm just really excited for what this next phase of Madison McFerrin is. And I'm really excited to share that with the rest of the world.
Well, I think there are a lot of people in the rest of the world that are excited to hear it too.
I hope so.
One thing that you talk about releasing new music, just quickly before we wrap it up. When I just went to your Spotify, one thing that I do notice about your output over the last handful of years is that it's a lot of singles and one-offs and collaborative things, and the whole concept of an album cycle is, it's still present, but in the meantime, there's all of these other little statements. And I don't think it's specific to you. I think it's more endemic of just what it is to put music out today. But it does seem like it's a byproduct of social media and the immediacy of the way we put things out. There's a lot of stuff up there that is sort of well, I did this thing, and then I did a collaboration with this person, and I did this song, and then I put this thing in. Do you think about making larger album statements versus the single or EP cycle?
Well, I'm working on an album right now, but part of having singles and EPs, and even before the album comes out, I'm going to be putting out a number of singles to lead up to it. You really have to build the audience first to be ready for a larger body of work now. Unfortunately, people's attention spans are so short that it's you really have to get them, you got to hook them first before you reel them in to be okay, are you ready to listen to a full body of work now? Instead of just 1 to 3 songs on an EP. So it's really just about kind of building that audience, building the momentum to ensure that when I do put out a full body of work, it's not that it just comes out and nobody listens to it. So I would much rather make sure that audience is cultivated and prepared, so that when I do put out something that's a little longer, that I trust that people are actually going to listen to the whole thing.
I dig it. And I'm taking notes. Madison McFerrin, thank you so much for taking time today, and safe travels.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
There she was, my friends. Madison McFerrin, preparing her audience. I dig it. I'll be back in your headspace before you know it. I'll leave you with a little taste of Madison's latest release. It's a version of the great Johnny Mercer song, Dream.
Dream, dream, when you're feeling blue. Dream, dream, that's the thing to do. Just watch the smoke rings rise in the air, and I know you'll find your share of memories there. So
I'll be back in your headspace before you know it. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.